Officer James Anderson thought he'd seen it all in his years of service. Dangerous criminals, life-threatening car chases, and tense standoffs. But nothing could prepare him for the moment his own heart failed him during a routine patrol. Collapsing in a deserted alley, he felt certain his life was slipping away, until his canine partner Max too made a choice no one could have predicted. Risking his own safety, Max leaped into action, proving that loyalty between a police officer and his dog can defy all odds. The day began just like any other for Officer James Anderson. An early rise, a quick coffee, and then off to the station where his faithful canine partner Max greeted him with an eager wag of the tail. Max was no ordinary German shepherd. He had been trained for months to detect narcotics, track fleeing suspects, and stand guard in perilous situations. Yet, despite his disciplined role, Max was also a beloved companion, bonded to James by countless hours spent patrolling the streets of Riverside County. On this particular morning, the radio crackled with routine calls, minor disturbances, traffic infractions, and a suspicious loiterer reported near an abandoned warehouse district. James and Max headed out, cruising through quiet neighborhoods that basked in the gentle glow of the rising sun. Through it all, Max perched in the back seat, ears pricked and eyes scanning the world outside, ever vigilant. Shortly after midday, they responded to a call from a local resident who'd noticed some strange activity in a back alley. Turned out to be nothing more than a couple of teenagers sneaking a smoke. James relaxed, teased them about picking better spots, and got back in his cruiser. He never guessed that, within minutes, his life would be in danger, not from a criminal but from his own body. As he turned the corner, a sudden jolt of pain gripped his chest. His vision blurred, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. James tried to steady the steering wheel, heart pounding erratically, breath coming in desperate gasps. Max sensed the shift immediately, whining in alarm from the back. The car drifted to a stop against a curb. Struggling, James managed to open the driver's door before collapsing onto the pavement. Cars passed by, oblivious, and the scorching sun beat down. His mind swirled with terror. He couldn't move, couldn't even shout for help. But Max, forced to watch his partner collapse, let out a frantic bark that shattered the stillness. The next moments would prove that no training could outshine the raw devotion of a dog determined to save his friend's life. That single bark marked the beginning of an extraordinary rescue, one that would test Max's courage and shatter every doubt about a canine's capacity for selfless loyalty. Officer James Anderson lay on the scorching asphalt, each ragged breath feeling like a knife to his chest. He'd never had a history of heart problems, at least none that he was aware of, but in that moment it felt like his heart was tearing itself apart. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and faint edges of darkness began to rim his vision. Somewhere behind him, Max was going wild, barking and whining in the cruiser's back seat. The dog sensed James's distress, pawing at the cage barrier that separated them. For most canine units, that barrier is a safety measure, protecting the dog, providing compartments for gear, and ensuring an officer can transport suspects if needed. But right now, it stood between Max and the partner he was frantic to help. James's thoughts blurred in and out. He was aware of the street, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional passerby who didn't stop. Perhaps they assumed he was just resting, or didn't notice the uniform half hidden by the cruiser's open door. Time became elastic, each second stretching painfully. His chest muscles screamed for oxygen. In some lucid corner of his mind, he knew he was having a heart attack. In the cruiser, Max's agitation grew. He barked in frenzied bursts, pacing the limited space. Training taught him to wait for commands, to stay put unless directed otherwise. But every instinct in the German shepherd told him something was terribly wrong. He could smell James's sweat, sense the spike in his partner's heart rate, and intuit the looming danger. In normal circumstances, a canine is never to leave the vehicle unless released by their handler or a designated emergency mechanism. Yet, canine vehicles often have a backup system for bailout or remote door release in critical scenarios. The question was, could Max trigger it? Some officers carry a remote, but James was in no condition to press any button. Max, panting in panic, leaped at the driver's partition, scrabbling at the metal. His nails screeched as they raked the steel mesh. The dog whined, eyes flicking to the front seat where James's gear lay. On that seat was an array of items, including a key fob that could unlock the rear door in certain emergencies, but it was well out of Max's reach, an improbable target for a dog to activate. But improbable didn't mean impossible. After several more desperate attempts to push through the mesh, Max paused, nostrils flaring. He sniffed the air, then jumped onto the front passenger seat with a determined huff. It was a clumsy move. The partition didn't leave much space. He had to contort his body, nearly tangling in the seatbelt. Yet somehow he managed to land awkwardly in the front, sending loose papers flying. James, barely conscious on the pavement, vaguely registered a flurry of motion inside the cruiser. His body felt leaden. He couldn't so much as lift a hand to signal for help. Somewhere in the haze, he heard Max's frantic yelps. A flicker of hope sparked in James's fading awareness. "Max, if anyone can save me, it's you." Inside the front seat, Max's nails scrabbled across the console. There, near the radio, was a simple red button labeled K9 Release, a feature some patrol cars carry to open a rear door or side door for the dog if the officer is incapacitated. The dog pressed his muzzle against it, but it wouldn't budge. Frantic, he pawed at it, then hit it with the side of his head. The latch gave a click, but not enough. Growling in frustration, Max repositioned. He repeated the move, bumping the button harder. This time, it depressed fully with a soft beep. Immediately, the rear passenger door popped open and Max scrambled back, leaping into the back seat and out into the open street. Free at last, Max dashed to James's side. The sight of his partner lying motionless, uniform shirt darkening with sweat, forced a guttural whine from deep in the dog's throat. He nosed James's face gently, receiving no response beyond a labored wheeze. Max barked, short, sharp calls that echoed off the concrete. People in nearby cars glanced over. Curiosity piqued. One pedestrian, noticing the uniform and the dog, slowed. "Is that an officer?" she murmured, eyes widening. When Max turned to her, barking, she realized this was no ordinary situation. She rushed forward, phone in hand. "Hang on, I'm calling 911. Yet ironically, the 911 system was already aware of an officer in trouble. The K9 release mechanism also triggered an auto alert at dispatch, marking the cruiser's GPS location as an emergency. Within seconds, the police radio crackled with urgent chatter. But time was ticking for James. Max darted around, scanning for more help. Another man approached, kneeling by James's side, checking for a pulse he could barely find. "He's in bad shape," the man muttered, pressing 2 fingers to James's neck. Adrenaline spiked in Max. He could smell the fear. In training, K9s learn many tasks: apprehension, detection, crowd control, but saving an officer from a heart attack. That was never part of the curriculum. Yet Max seemed to draw on a primal drive to protect his pack. He placed both front paws on James's chest, whimpering, as if trying to urge him to keep breathing. The woman on the phone shouted, "Hurry, he's not responding." A distant siren approached, wailing through city streets. The uniform of an approaching officer flashed in the midday sun, and Max backed away slightly, allowing the professional responders to swoop in. An EMT team from a nearby station arrived, skid-turning their ambulance to a stop. They spilled out with a gurney and defibrillator, clearing onlookers. Max stood watch, ears pinned back anxiously, as paramedics cut open James's uniform to apply AED pads. They delivered a shock, James's body jolting. Max barked, each yelp stabbing the silence. Another shock. James drew a ragged breath, and then, slowly, his heartbeat stabilized. The paramedics moved in, hooking him to oxygen, loading him onto the gurney. Max followed closely, but officers gently restrained him. "Easy, boy," one said softly. "We'll take care of him. You've done your job." Tears pricked the corners of the paramedic's eyes. Seeing a dog so distraught over his partner's plight tugged at every heartstring. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, sirens blared anew, whisking James Anderson toward the nearest ER. Max tried to leap in after him, howling in protest. A fellow K9 officer, who had arrived on scene, stepped forward to comfort him. "We'll get you to the hospital, buddy," he promised, leading Max to another cruiser. Though the dog paced and whimpered, he eventually settled, exhausted from the ordeal. Beside him, the new officer murmured reassurance. Little did Max know that, in the coming days, his actions would become the stuff of legend among law enforcement circles, a canine's unwavering devotion, bridging the gap between life and death. For now, the only thing that mattered was that James was alive, his heart beating again thanks to the unstoppable loyalty of a partner who refused to let him die alone on the scorching pavement. The ambulance's sirens wailed through the city streets as Officer James Anderson lay on the stretcher, fighting for every breath. Paramedics hovered over him, monitoring his vitals and administering medication to stabilize his heart. Outside, midday traffic pulled aside, granting the speeding vehicle a path, while news of the incident began to ripple through the police radio. Somewhere in another cruiser, Max, the loyal K9 partner, whined in agitation, desperate to stay close to the man he'd just saved. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of Riverside County General. A waiting team of ER staff whisked James through sliding doors, calling out instructions in practiced unison. Dr. Emilia Huang, an experienced cardiologist, led the charge. In her years of practice, she'd seen many heart attack victims, but rarely an officer arrived with a story of rescue by his own K9. In the rush of medical urgency, James barely clung to consciousness. His heart rate spiked again, sending alarms beeping frantically. "Doctor." Huang ordered immediate tests, an ECG, blood draws for cardiac enzymes, and a rush to the cath lab if needed. Nurses placed an oxygen mask over James's face, hooking him up to IV lines. Medical jargon ricocheted off the tiled walls, a backdrop to the life-or-death drama unfolding. Meanwhile, James drifted in and out of awareness. Whenever he surfaced, he felt the crushing weight on his chest, heard fragments of conversations, and sensed the rush of people fighting for him. He had enough presence of mind to recall Max, his dependable partner, and the desperate scramble that preceded this moment. "Am I dying?" The thought flitted across his mind, accompanied by an unexpected calm. He was a trained officer, well acquainted with peril, but facing his own mortality in a hospital bed felt profoundly different. Outside, a second police cruiser arrived, carrying Max and another K9 officer named Rena Delgado. Max paced on the back seat, occasionally pawing at the window and letting out pitiful whines that tugged at Delgado's heart. "Easy, Max," she murmured, pulling into an emergency parking zone. "We're here. He's going to be okay." Leading Max out on a leash, Delgado approached the ER's bustling entrance. Hospital security hesitated, unsure about allowing a K9 inside. But Delgado flashed her badge and explained the situation. Max was no ordinary dog. He was Anderson's partner and had just performed a heroic act. Moved by this, the security guard radioed for permission to let them wait in a designated corridor. In that corridor, Max's nails clicked on the floor, his ears pinned back in anxiety. He sniffed the air, nose picking up the unmistakable scent of antiseptics and the lingering fear of patients. Delgado crouched next to him, patting his flank. "Hang tight, buddy. We'll get news soon." Time stretched tortuously for everyone involved. Word of the officer's heart attack spread through the precinct, and soon a handful of colleagues arrived, bearing concerned expressions and quiet determination. They found Delgado and Max in the corridor, waiting for an update. The dog's relentless pacing made it clear the tension was mutual. Human and canine alike dreaded the unknown. Finally, Dr. Huang emerged, tugging down her surgical mask. The group of officers straightened at her appearance, hope mingling with dread. Max whimpered softly, as if sensing the importance of her words. Dr. Huang offered a reassuring nod. "We performed an angiogram and inserted a stent to open his blocked coronary artery. Officer Anderson's condition has stabilized for now, but the next 24 hours are critical." A chorus of relieved sighs swept over the officers. Delgado gave Max a fond ruffle between the ears, murmuring, "Hear that, boy? He's alive." "You did good." The news spread quickly. An officer on routine patrol suffered a heart attack and was saved by his own K9. Media outlets caught wind of the story, and within hours, news vans arrived at the hospital's periphery. Reporters peppered the police with questions. How did Max manage to free himself from the squad car? Was there a device that triggered the door? Was the dog specifically trained for medical emergencies? Chief Rossman, head of the Riverside Police Department, arrived to handle the press. He faced microphones outside the hospital entrance, a stoic expression on his face. We can confirm that K9 Max took extraordinary measures to alert bystanders and release himself from the cruiser. His swift actions undoubtedly contributed to Officer Anderson's survival. We are proud to call them both part of our department. Inside, hospital administration offered a special dispensation, allowing Max to remain on site as a form of comfort for James once he awoke. "It's the least we can do," said the hospital's PR representative. "The bond between a service dog and its officer is critical to the healing process." Late that night, in the ICU, James opened his eyes to a haze of fluorescent light. Tubes and wires crisscrossed his body, and pain radiated through his chest. He felt weak, but alive. A fragile victory. Memory rushed back in disjointed fragments, the car drifting, the agony in his chest, Max barking, chaos. A nurse hovered near, noticing he was awake. "Officer Anderson, you're in Riverside County General ICU. You had a heart attack. We performed emergency treatment. You're stable now." He nodded weakly, relief mingling with residual fear. Soft footsteps approached. Dr. Huang appeared at the bedside, offering a gentle smile. "We'll need to keep you under observation, but your prognosis is good." She paused. "Your dog, Max, he's been here, waiting. Would you like to see him?" James's eyes glistened. He managed a faint nod, throat too tight to speak. Moments later, Delgado entered with Max and who approached the bed warily, as if unsure of hospital protocol. The instant Max recognized James's scent, his tail wagged in a trembling flurry of excitement. A muffled bark escaped him, and James lifted a trembling hand to pat Max's head. Tears welled in the officer's eyes at the sight of his partner, safe and well. In that solemn ICU room, with machines beeping softly, James felt a profound wave of gratitude. He owed his life to Max, the loyal friend who refused to let him die alone. Emotions overwhelmed him, relief, humility, and an unbreakable bond reaffirmed. Dr. Huang and Delgado looked on, moved by the quiet moment. A dog's unwavering devotion had bridged the gap between life and death, forging a story of heroism few would ever forget. As James drifted back to a doze, Dr. Huang whispered to Delgado that James's recovery would be gradual, involving cardiac rehab and lifestyle changes. Delgado nodded. Max, still at the bedside, placed his chin lightly on the mattress, gazing at James with deep, soulful eyes. The improbable rescue that had unfolded mere hours ago signaled not an ending, but a new chapter in their partnership, one where James might need Max's emotional support more than ever, and where Max, having proven his extraordinary devotion, would be recognized as much more than a K9 officer. He was a true companion, a hero who refused to let fate claim his partner before his time. The sun dipped low over Riverside County General, painting the sky in muted oranges and pinks. Inside the hospital, quiet tension prevailed. Officer James Anderson had stabilized in the ICU, and the story of his miraculous rescue by K9 Max was already spreading far beyond city limits. The doctors observed him carefully, ensuring his heart recovered from the traumatic event. Meanwhile, Max lay curled up on a small pad near James's bed, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of footsteps. A nurse slipped in to change an IV bag, offering the dog a grateful smile. News had reached everyone about how Max's quick instincts had saved James's life. The sight of a K9 in the ICU was unusual, yet comforting. It was as if the entire staff understood the necessity of their companionship. In the corridor, Dr. Amelia Huang, James's attending cardiologist, conversed with Captain Ellis, head of the precinct where James served. "He's improving," Dr. Huang explained, "but it was a close call. Another few minutes without intervention." Captain Ellis, a tall, stoic figure with a firm jaw, exhaled and ran a hand over his buzz-cut hair. "I can't believe he had no prior symptoms," he muttered. "James always seemed fit. But we all push ourselves too hard sometimes. Dr. Huang nodded, her gaze drifting toward the room where James rested. We'll need to watch him for complications, arrhythmias, potential clots, but I'm optimistic. He owes that dog a debt I don't think he can ever repay. Detective Sandra Delgado, who had brought Max to the hospital, remained nearby, awaiting any sign that James might want to talk or that Max needed a break. She couldn't shake a growing sense of unease, though. The official report said James simply collapsed from a sudden heart attack, but rumors circulated around the station that James had been under immense stress from a confidential case. A big operation, some whispered, that had demanded near-constant overtime. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating well, an officer had confided to Delgado. Not since that last bust where everything nearly went south. Could that have contributed to his sudden health crisis? Delgado wondered. If so, the precinct might face scrutiny for overworking its staff, or at the very least, prompting a culture of ignoring personal health. She planned to ask James gently once he was lucid enough to answer. Late that evening, as the hospital settled into the hush of night, a nurse spotted an unfamiliar figure lingering near the ICU security desk. He was dressed in a plain black jacket, collar pulled high, face partially obscured by a baseball cap. When asked if he needed assistance, the man mumbled something about visiting a friend, then ducked down a side hallway. Sensing something off, the nurse alerted hospital security. Soon, 2 guards started a quiet search, but the man seemed to have vanished. The incident rattled them. Could it be just another curious bystander who'd heard about James's rescue, or was there more? James dozed fitfully, half propped by pillows, Max snoozing at the foot of the bed. Doctor. Huang's footsteps were a gentle patter against the polished floor as she entered, stethoscope in hand. She measured his blood pressure, checked monitors, and recorded improvements. James stirred, opening his eyes blearily. "Hey, Doc," he rasped, voice hoarse. She offered a reassuring nod. "Your ECG looks promising. We may move you out of ICU in a few days if this trend continues." James exhaled, relief mingling with lingering anxiety. "And Max? They're not kicking him out, are they?" A soft laugh escaped her. "That dog's practically staff now. Everyone who hears the story wants to visit." She hesitated, then added gently, "You really scared us, Officer Anderson. A heart attack at your age. Maybe once you're stable, we should discuss lifestyle changes." His gaze fell to where Max slept, muzzle resting on his paws. "I know," he whispered. "I guess I forgot to take care of myself." Always on the move. Their conversation was interrupted by the piercing wail of an alarm. Dr. Huang's pager vibrated, showing an urgent code on the 5th floor, cardiac ward. She exchanged a worried look with James. The ICU staff sprang into action, some nurses rushing past the door. Over the intercom, a brief announcement. "Code blue, 5th floor, code blue." James's heart lurched. Was it another patient in crisis, or something else? Dr. Huang patted his arm. "Stay calm. Let us handle this." She exited in a hurry, leaving James alone with Max, who woke at the sound of commotion. Max perked up, ears twitching, eyes darting to the door. He let out a low whine, glancing at James as if asking permission to investigate. James, who'd been still too weak to sit up fully, offered a faint smile. "Relax, buddy. Let the doctors do their job." But the dog remained unsettled. A minute later, the alarm abruptly cut off. A hush fell, thick with tension. Footsteps approached quickly. Suddenly, the door swung open, revealing Captain Ellis, face lined with urgency. "James," Ellis said, stepping in. He nodded at Max. "We've got a situation. Another officer from your precinct just collapsed upstairs with chest pains. They're stabilizing him now." James's eyes widened in shock. "Who?" Ellis hesitated, swallowing hard. "Bennett, Officer Bennett." He cleared his throat. "He's had mild hypertension for years, but no one expected this. Now we've got 2 heart issues in the same force, practically the same day. It's..." Ellis trailed off, anger and worry seeping into his voice. James felt a chill. Could it be a coincidence? Even as he asked, something in him doubted it. 2 officers, both straining under heavy workloads, dropping from cardiac events. Or was there more? A strange tension crackled. James and Ellis locked gazes, mutual understanding passing unspoken. The precinct had been pushing everyone hard, working on high-profile cases. Stress, combined with inadequate rest, could certainly lead to health crises. But was there a deeper thread? Some silent wave of guilt seemed to ripple through Ellis's stoic demeanor. "I need you to focus on recovering," Ellis said quietly, as if dismissing potential conspiracy talk. "We'll get to the bottom of this. In the meantime, you rest." James's heart pounded with worry. For Bennett, for the mounting pressure the department faced. Max let out a soft bark, perhaps sensing the tension. As Ellis left, James slumped back against the pillows, a headache throbbing behind his eyes. If Bennett's collapse was truly another heart attack triggered by stress, the department's entire culture might be in for scrutiny. He recalled the long nights, skipping meals, ignoring Max's worried whines when he barely slept. Guilt coiled in his stomach. Then he looked to Max, who sidled up, placing his chin on the bed's edge. James reached out to scratch behind the ears of his loyal friend, this living reminder that loyalty can save lives, but it cannot substitute self-care. The tension in James's chest was not just physical anymore, it was the emotional weight of seeing a second officer fall. No matter the cause, James resolved to get stronger, to speak up about the hidden toll that relentless duty exacted. Max's devoted eyes seemed to say, "I'm here, partner. We'll face it together." And in that moment, James clung to the quiet, powerful bond that had already proven strong enough to conquer death itself. The news of Officer Bennett's collapse spread through Riverside County General like a fresh gust of wind, carrying shock and concern in its wake. Hospital staff who had just begun to relax after James's crisis now found themselves bracing for another emergency. This time, they rushed the newly arrived patient into a neighboring ICU room. The flurry of activity left the corridors buzzing with tension. Officer James Anderson wrestled with guilt and worry. He had scarcely absorbed his own close call when news reached him of Bennett's arrival. Heart heavy, he glanced at his own IV lines, remembering the terror of losing control over his body. Max, picking up on his partner's restless energy, shuffled closer, paws resting near James's side. A quiet whine escaped the dog's throat, as if to say, "I'm here, and you're not alone." James reached out and let his hand rest on Max's head, fingers sliding gently through the dog's thick coat. "How many of us have to crash before something changes?" he murmured. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but the dog's worried gaze made him think of all the times Max had looked at him with that same concern, nudging him toward breaks he'd ignored, or urging him outside for fresh air he'd brushed off. Maybe Max had known all along that the pressure was too much. Captain Ellis, pacing by the ICU station, pressed a phone to his ear. "Yes, Chief, it's the second officer in as many days," he said in a clipped tone. "I've requested a departmental wellness check. We need to take stress injuries seriously." He paused, listening. "I'm aware of the high-profile case, but these are people, not machines." Another pause. "Understood, sir. I'll keep you updated." With that, he ended the call. Frustration etched on his face. Detective Sandra Delgado, who'd brought Max to the hospital initially, approached, her expression taut. "How's Bennett?" she asked quietly. Ellis shook his head, exhaling. "Not great. He's stable, but they're monitoring him closely. Could be a mild heart attack, similar to James's condition." Delgado felt a sinking sensation in her gut. 2 heart attacks among relatively young officers, right after intense ops, was too coincidental for comfort. Seeking clarity, Captain Ellis requested a brief meeting with Dr. Emilia Huang, the cardiologist overseeing James's care. They found a quiet nook near the staff lounge, where the hum of vending machines formed a faint backdrop to their tense discussion. "Is it normal to have 2 officers from the same department experience severe cardiac events?" Ellis asked, struggling to maintain composure. Dr. Huang folded her arms, her white coat rustling slightly. "Statistically, it's unusual but not impossible. Stress, poor diet, lack of rest. These factors compound risk, especially if they share high-pressure work conditions." Ellis rubbed his temples. "We run a rigorous department, but I never thought it could drive men to heart attacks." He exhaled. meeting Dr. Huang's eyes. "What can we do?" She offered a sympathetic shrug. "Encourage mandatory health screenings, counseling, more frequent breaks, anything that allows officers to decompress." A pause. "Look, I can't fix your department's culture, Captain, but I can tell you that forcing these men to push themselves relentlessly is a recipe for further crises." Her words struck Ellis like a blow. He realized how often they'd applauded overworking, equating it with dedication. Now 2 of his best were paying the price. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, voice subdued. "I'll take it up the chain." The newly arrived officer lay with eyes half-lidded, an oxygen mask strapped to his face. Detective Delgado, having gained permission to briefly visit, stood quietly by the bed. She'd known Bennett as a jovial guy, always ready with a quip, but the man before her was pallid, exhausted, weighed down by tubes and monitors. "We almost lost you," she whispered. "Why'd we let ourselves get to this point?" Bennett, too weak to respond, simply squeezed her hand in acknowledgement. Back in James's room, the canine curled at his partner's bedside, letting out low, occasional whimpers. Nursing staff commented on how unusual it was to see a working dog so visibly distressed, but the staff also couldn't deny the dog's beneficial effect on James's mood. Every time James's heart rate spiked, brought on by anxious thoughts, Max would whine or nudge his partner, and the monitors would show James's rate gradually calming again. One nurse joked, "We might start prescribing a canine visit for all heart patients," earning a few tired smiles. But behind the levity lay a genuine observation. Max was providing emotional support, every bit as crucial as medication, in helping James cope with this life-altering event. Late that night, as hospital activity dimmed to its typical nocturnal hush, James found himself awake, insomnia fueled by medication side effects and swirling doubts. Max dozed lightly, muzzle on James's arm. In the corridor, the glow of overhead lights fell in elongated rectangles, occasionally broken by a passing nurse. Staring at the ceiling, James finally let himself confront a painful truth. He'd been ignoring Max's warnings for weeks, warnings in the form of worried eyes when James skipped meals, insistent whines when nights bled into dawn during stakeouts, and forlorn barks when days off were abandoned to chase leads. "I should have listened," he mumbled, voice cracking with remorse. Had it not been for Max's extraordinary actions the previous day, he might not be alive to have that thought at all. His chest tightened, not from physical pain this time, but from the weight of gratitude and guilt. Slowly, he reached out, resting his palm on Max's flank. The dog stirred, shifting closer. "Thank you," James breathed, tears misting his eyes. "I promise, I'll make changes." In that quiet vow, a flicker of resolve ignited. If he survived this ordeal, he would champion a healthier environment for himself and his fellow officers. No more lost sleep and reckless disregard for personal limits. The cost was too high. In the days to come, the aftershocks of James's heart attack would resonate throughout the department. Captain Ellis would push for reforms, mandated checkups, and stress management programs. Bennett's condition might prompt a city-wide conversation about policing and mental health. But for now, in this small ICU room, one man and one dog reaffirmed the bond that had sustained them in the darkest hour, promising that no duty was worth sacrificing their lives or each other. Officer James Anderson's hospital room had become a makeshift focal point for concern, curiosity, and above all, reflection. A steady trickle of fellow officers, well-wishers, and medical professionals passed through, each bringing a mixture of relief and unresolved tension. While everyone was thankful that James had survived his heart attack with the help of his canine partner, Max, the broader question of why it happened still lingered in the air, refusing to be dismissed as a mere fluke. News of James's crisis, coupled with Officer Bennett's near-simultaneous collapse, sent shockwaves through the precinct. Unofficial chatter hinted at internal investigations into departmental policies. Some officers privately confessed to skipping annual checkups or ignoring chest pains, fearful they might be deemed unfit for duty. The possibility of discovering that the precinct's relentless pace contributed to these medical emergencies unsettled many. Lieutenant Diana Mills, a longtime friend of James Des, was among those who visited him, Standing by his bed, she didn't hide her worries. "James," she began softly, "I've been hearing rumors. Higher-ups might enforce mandatory wellness screenings. There's talk of reassigning staff from intense units to lighter roles if they show signs of chronic stress." James, still pale but regaining strength each day, pursed his lips. "That might be a good thing," he admitted, gently resting a hand on Max's head. The dog's ears perked at the soft conversation. "If it saves more people from what I went through, then it's worth it." Litty. Mills nodded, though her gaze fell to the floor. "Some of the younger officers, they see it as a threat to their careers. They worry they'll be sidelined, lose promotions." A sigh escaped James. "Yeah, well, it's better than losing their lives." Meanwhile, the hospital found itself juggling new complexities. The sudden presence of multiple police officers, some as patients, others supporting them, changed the usual bustle. Concerned staff started discussing the broader mental health issues in law enforcement. Dr. Emilia Huang, monitoring James's recovery, was approached by a nurse who tentatively asked how they could encourage officers to seek help without fear of repercussions. "That's the crux of it," Dr. Huang replied, scribbling notes on James's chart. "If they see medical intervention as a career risk, they'll hide symptoms. But we can't fix it alone. It needs departmental buy-in." In a break-room conversation, a paramedic chimed in. "It's not just cops, firefighters, paramedics. We all face that pressure to soldier on. Maybe this'll spark a citywide conversation." And so a new subplot emerged. Local medical staff and first responders quietly discussing the need for a cross-agency wellness initiative. "If we coordinate with the police and fire chiefs, maybe we can create a safe environment for them to get help," Dr. Wang proposed. Nurses, paramedics, and a few supportive officers eagerly latched onto the idea. While James rested, Max became something of a celebrity among the hospital staff and local media. Journalists who'd first reported on James's heart attack now highlighted the dog's quick thinking and unstoppable devotion. One reporter managed to speak with Detective Sandra Delgado, who'd arrived with Max at the hospital. Her on-camera comment that Max refused to let Officer Anderson die went viral, warming hearts across the city. Various organizations, K9 units from neighboring counties, animal welfare charities, even a local dog food company, reached out, offering praise or supplies for Max. The hospital's reception desk fielded calls from parents, asking if their children could meet the heroic dog. Turning him into an unwitting ambassador for K9 service animals, James, though touched, seemed more humble than ever. "He's just my partner," he told a nurse who mentioned the fan mail arriving. "He'd do the same for any of us." Still, deep down, James felt a swirl of gratitude and awe. He knew that if Max hadn't taken matters into his own paws, literally, he might not be here to see the next sunrise. "Good boy," he whispered often, petting the dog with quiet reverence. Officer Bennett, stabilized in a nearby ICU room, faced a tougher recovery. Dr. Huang and her team noted more extensive damage to his heart muscle, likely from ignoring early symptoms. The departmental rumor mill suggested Bennett had confided in a friend about chest pains weeks ago, but refused to see a doctor for fear of being sidelined. Captain Ellis, feeling the weight of leadership, visited Bennett one afternoon. The older officer was propped against pillows, tubes still attached. "I'm sorry," Ellis said, voice wavering. "We pushed you too hard, pushed everyone too hard." Bennett managed a weak smile, though lines of pain etched his face. "We push ourselves. I thought I could handle it. Didn't want to let the team down, you know?" The admission hung in the sterile air, heavy with regret. Ellis nodded, promising changes, though neither man could fully articulate how those changes would take shape. A few days later, once James was strong enough to stand with assistance, Dr. Huang arranged a small gathering in a private lounge. Present were James and Bennett, still frail but determined, Captain Ellis, Detective Delgado, and Dr. Costa from an earlier shift. Max lay attentively at James's feet, ears perked, as though sensing this was a pivotal moment. "We owe these men and this dog more than a debt of gratitude," Dr. Huang began, tone measured. "Their experiences highlight a systemic issue: overwork, insufficient health screenings, reluctance to take medical leave. We see it in law enforcement, firefighting, paramedicine. It ends with people in these beds or worse. Captain Ellis cleared his throat, glancing at James and Bennett in turn. Effective immediately, I'm coordinating with the chief to institute mandatory wellness checks for our officers. We're also establishing a mental health liaison. I don't want to lose any more of you. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Bennett, voice still weak, murmured, "We can't keep ignoring the red flags." James gave a subtle nod, heart pounding, not with arrhythmia this time, but with emotion at the shared resolve. Detective Delgado spoke up. "We might face pushback from some officers. They fear losing assignments or pay. We need to reassure them that stepping forward about stress or chest pains won't end their careers." Dr. Costa interjected gently, "No job is worth more than a life." If Max hadn't intervened for James, we'd be telling a very different story right now. The discussion continued, forging a new path for the precinct, one that valued well-being as much as duty. And in that hush of agreement, James lightly patted Max's head, the dog gazing up with trusting eyes. The bond they shared, human and canine, had become an emblem of what law enforcement could be: protective, courageous, and profoundly loyal. The daily rhythm of the police department slowed abruptly after the collapses of James Anderson and Officer Bennett. On the one hand, colleagues were even more vigilant about their health. On the other, a collective feeling of anxiety spread, as if everyone feared that next could be them. Inside the hospital, meanwhile, James and Bennett were in different stages of rehabilitation. Bennett was still weak, subject to constant monitoring to avoid new heart complications. James, stronger, was making small progress under the careful guidance of physical therapists and cardiologists. Captain Ellis was keeping his commitment to reform the internal approach. An initial working table on officer health had been set up, inviting representatives of the hospital medical corps as well. The climate, however, was tense. Several officers complained that forcing everyone to checkups and forced breaks would slow down crime-fighting operations. "If we're always on medical watch, we won't be able to keep up with criminals," muttered one veteran. "What happens if we're chasing a suspect and my heart decides to play a trick on me? Will they take away my plaque?" A young officer, however, was relieved. "My father died of a heart attack while on duty. Maybe if I had these controls, he would still be alive. I say it's time for us to take care of ourselves." Meanwhile, James was receiving visitors, friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances. The room was filled with greeting cards, balloons, and, of course, attention for Max, the undisputed star. Between checks, James stopped to talk to Bennett, who was in a wheelchair in the hallway. Max followed them, wagging his tail cautiously among the nurses. "I never thought I'd end up like this," Bennett said, his voice slightly cracked with emotion. "You know, I was afraid of being injured in the line of duty, but a heart attack." He lowered his gaze, defeated. James sighed. "We're all human, Bennett. We've ignored signals for too long. We got away with it this time. But if Max had not intervened..." The other nodded, his gaze settling on Max near their feet. "This dog should get a medal. He saved your life, and maybe mine too, by snapping everyone to attention." It was during those days that something unexpected arrived. An envelope with no sender, delivered to the hospital and addressed to Officer James Anderson and K9 Max. The staff, intrigued, handed it directly to James. Inside was a plain sheet of paper with a few handwritten lines. "You are not machines. You don't have to be 24-hour heroes. Thank you for showing us how much heart and courage are needed, and how fragile is the line between them." No signature, no clue to the author. Perhaps a citizen affected by the story, or a colleague afraid to expose himself. James read and reread those words several times. For the first time, he felt he had changed something not only in his own life, but in the lives of others. As James's condition improved, his doctor recommended a long period of convalescence. "It would be wise to reduce the intense patrol activity," Dr. Huang said firmly, "at least for a few months. Also, think about reassessment of your job position. I don't want to see you back on this bed in a worse condition." This prospect shook James. He loved his job. He felt he still had a lot to give. What about Max? Should he have left the K9 unit? In the quiet of his room, Sitting next to Max, looking at him with those faithful eyes, James pondered, if he became a desk officer, would Max be reassigned to another younger partner? The idea of parting with his faithful partner made him shudder. Meanwhile, the hospital had begun to tell James and Max's story to younger patients, especially in the pediatric ward, as an example of courage and friendship. So it was that one day, Nurse Lucia Fay brought a wheelchair-bound child who had been ill for some time in front of James' room. The child, Shai, asked if he could see the little dog who saves people. James, with the doctor's permission, welcomed the little boy into the room, and Max came wagging his tail. The baby reached out a trembling hand to stroke the soft fur. "You are a hero," he whispered, a shy smile. The nurse smiled back. For a moment, the room seemed to glow with a rare positivity. Lo and behold, a dog that had given an officer his life back was now giving a moment of joy to a child battling illness. Driven by these emotions, James began to think about how to use his experience constructively. He talked with Delgado and hospital staff about an idea: create a visiting program of well-trained canines to bring comfort to pediatric wards. "I'm not talking about standard patrol dogs," he explained, "but animals trained for interaction with patients as pet therapy. We could expand the concept, matching sick children with selected dogs." The proposal was met with initial enthusiasm, but also with some logistical and regulatory reservations. However, just talking about it generated a wave of hope. If Max had been able to save an officer in crisis, who was to say what benefit he could bring to a child battling his own illness or an officer in burnout? "First of all, you need to get well," Dr. Huang admonished him after hearing the proposal. "Don't forget that you have a heart in need of rest and rehabilitation. You can't save the world if you don't save yourself." James smiled faintly, nodding. He had already spoken with Captain Ellis, aware that once discharged, he would face a long absence from duty. Nevertheless, the idea of helping the department develop a plan to reduce operational stress motivated him. Max, sitting by his side, nuzzled Dr. Huang's hand as if in approval. Meanwhile, Bennett continued his recovery in another wing of the hospital. Rumor had it that he, too, had begun to reevaluate priorities. Someone heard him mutter, "Maybe when I get out of here, moving to a less burdensome assignment is not a defeat. I want to live long enough to see my children grow up." Thus, the future of both officers and the entire department was poised between the tradition of consuming work and the hope of a healthier approach. And Maxa, the canine who had shown the world how much a dog could do for his partner, remained at the center of this ongoing change, the living testimony that even the strongest need help, that even heroes must be protected and guided. And it was in those very corridors, between beeping monitors and white sheets, that a new mission was emerging for James and Max. No longer just patrols and arrests, but also understanding and support for the community, for colleagues, and for the fragile line between life and loss. A subdued hush settled over the hospital corridors in the days following James's and Bennett's heart incidents. Although both officers were on the mend, a sense of unease lingered like an unspoken cloud. People in uniform no longer exchanged casual jokes about the job. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones about checkups and warning signs. When paramedics came through with a new patient, there was always that flash of fear in the eyes of passing officers. Could the next one be me? Back at the precinct, Captain Ellis continued pushing forward with wellness reforms, mandatory blood pressure checks, an official recommendation for therapy sessions, and enforced rest days quickly became topics of debate among the ranks. Some officers welcomed the changes, relieved that someone was finally acknowledging the punishing stress. Others resisted, worrying they'd be benched or labeled weak for taking a day off. Detective Sandra Delgado, who had grown particularly close to Max since that fateful day, found herself acting as an informal liaison between the precinct and the hospital. She'd drop by to update James on the department's new steps, then relay any ideas he had back to Ellis. More than once, Delgado overheard quiet admissions from fellow officers: a detective who'd been popping antacids for months to manage stomach pains, a sergeant who'd collapsed from exhaustion in his own driveway. Real stories, no longer hidden behind a wall of silence. Not everyone embraced the new policies with open arms, however. A group of older veterans, some only a few years from retirement, voiced complaints that the department was coddling the younger generation. "We worked these hours for decades," one grumbled, "and we turned out just fine. If you can't handle the heat, you don't belong in the force." The shift in culture spurred arguments in the locker rooms and the break rooms, with officers exchanging heated words about pride, tradition, and well-being. Captain Ellis, standing in the center of this storm, did his best to mediate. Still, he feared that if morale dipped too low, more crises might unfold, either from hidden stress or from resentment brewing among the ranks. James made slow but steady progress in his recovery, guided by Dr. Huang's cautious but optimistic approach. Each morning, a physical therapist arrived to help him with gentle exercises, stretching, walking short distances in the hallway, building up stamina. At first, he felt embarrassed at how easily he tired. Yet each small milestone, managing a short flight of stairs, regaining the ability to dress himself without breathlessness, reaffirmed that he was on the right path. Bennett, housed in a different ward, showed signs of improvement as well. However, his road to recovery was more complicated. He still struggled with occasional chest pains and a longer list of medication. Between therapy sessions, he and James sometimes met in the hospital cafeteria, both assisted by IV poles or wearing heart monitors. Their quiet conversations often circled back to the demands of their job and the anxious question, will we ever be strong enough to return to active duty? Max, the K9 hero, had become a fixture not just in James's room, but increasingly among the hospital staff as well. Nurses and doctors occasionally invited him to visit pediatric patients, who brightened at the sight of a friendly German shepherd, Dr. Emilia Costa, who'd previously handled a separate case that also involved a heroic dog, took a particular interest in Max's effect on patients' morale. She noted that children who were lethargic or withdrawn often perked up when Max padded in, tail wagging. Encouraged by these small miracles, James and Delgado discussed reviving the therapy dog concept James had mentioned during his early recovery. Though Max was primarily trained for law enforcement tasks, the dog's obvious empathy and calm presence suggested he could adapt to short therapy visits in controlled environments. Even the hospital's management seemed intrigued. "He's already proven an innate gift," one administrator remarked. Of course, protocol and legal concerns had to be addressed. Max was still a sworn K9, and the hospital was an environment of vulnerable patients. But Delgado, with help from certain hospital administrators, started drafting a pilot program. If successful, Max's presence could pave the way for a specialized cadre of K9s that offered both public safety and emotional support. Yet not all was hopeful. A creeping anxiety gnawed at James during quiet nights. What if he couldn't return to the force at all? A part of him dreaded the possibility of being assigned a desk job. His father, an officer before him, had always said real police work happened on the streets. Another part of him worried that if he did go back to patrol, he might push himself too far again, risking Max's life as well as his own. He voiced these fears late one evening when the ward was calm and the overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow. Max rested at his feet, muzzle on his paws. Delgado, who had come by to check on him, leaned against the doorframe. "I don't want to let anyone down," James said, voice trembling, "but I owe it to Max, to my family, to stay alive." Delgado offered a gentle smile. "So you're not letting anyone down by taking care of yourself. If anything, you're setting an example. Max can keep working with you if you shift your role. There's more to policing than adrenaline-packed patrols, you know." Those words lingered like a steady anchor, giving James a sense of permission he didn't realize he needed, to consider a future in law enforcement that didn't revolve around risking his heart day in and day out. Even as new opportunities rose, stress remained an unwelcome companion. The hospital staff quietly prepped James for possible discharge within a week. Captain Ellis, trying to address rumors, assured him, "We'll find a place for you, James. Maybe training new recruits or an investigative desk job, something that doesn't push you into overdrive." James nodded with mixed relief and sadness. Could he find fulfillment off the streets? Maxie, for his part, sensed the emotional swirl. The dog had become a calming presence for nearly everyone who visited James's room, officers, doctors, and especially children. But behind those gentle eyes, he remained a vigilant protector. The moment James's heart monitor beeped an irregular rhythm, Max would perk up, whining or nudging him until a nurse checked. More than once, staff joked that Max was more reliable than any alarm system. As the precinct and hospital both shifted under the weight of these revelations, a delicate balance emerged: adapt or risk losing more lives. Each person, James, Don, Bennett, Delgado, Ellis, grappled with internal battles, deciding how to embrace necessary changes without sacrificing the pride and dedication that had defined them for so long. Meanwhile, Max's story continued to circulate, a poignant reminder that even in the bleakest moments, unwavering loyalty and compassion could forge a path to survival, and maybe even to a stronger, healthier department. As the sun dipped below the horizon one late afternoon, a gentle hush settled over Riverside County General Hospital. The fluorescent lights in Officer James Anderson's room glowed softly, illuminating Max curled contentedly at the foot of the bed. James absently stroked the German shepherd's ears, his thoughts troubled despite the calm atmosphere. He'd been making gradual strides in physical therapy, enough to leave his bed for short walks unassisted, with Max at his side. Doctor Huang had even hinted that he could be discharged soon, pending a final cardiac evaluation. But James couldn't shake the swirl of emotions each time he imagined stepping out of the hospital, return to the force as the man he was before. Possibly. But then came the memory of collapsing in that alley, chest seizing with agonizing pain, and the stark realization that he'd nearly died. Was diving back into the same high-stress environment worth the risk? And what would become of his canine partner? Captain Ellis and Detective Delgado had visited earlier that day, bringing news that the department was drafting new guidelines for officers recovering from medical emergencies, particularly those with heart conditions. A desk job or administrative task was likely, at least temporarily. And for Max, a specialized canine like him could be reassigned to another patrol officer if James couldn't continue high-intensity duty. The notion tore at James's heart. Max was more than a tool of law enforcement. He was family. Every time James pictured handing Max over to a new handler, he felt a wave of sorrow. Yet a flicker of rationality insisted that if James wasn't physically capable, perhaps Max deserved an active role with someone else. Guilt warred with the sense of duty, and the bond they'd forged during the life-threatening moment when Max had saved him. In a neighboring ward, Officer Bennett, recovering from his own heart attack, had made a different choice. Word spread that he'd filed for early retirement, citing family concerns and a desire to prioritize his long-term health. When James heard this news, his chest tightened, not from arrhythmia, but from empathy and dread. If Bennett, once full of bravado, had decided to leave the force entirely, perhaps that option was more realistic than James dared admit. Still, James didn't feel ready to let go. He had a sense of unfinished purpose. There are other ways to serve, he told himself, remembering the times he'd taken younger recruits under his wing, or the fleeting idea of therapy dog outreach he'd discussed with Delgado. Maybe policing wasn't limited to adrenaline-soaked street duty. Late in the evening, as James dozed with Max, the door to his room cracked open. A faint hush of footsteps told him someone was there before he opened his eyes. Blinking, he found the silhouette of Chief Rossman, head of the precinct. The chief rarely made personal hospital visits, especially at night. Rossman cleared his throat softly, stepping in. "Officer Anderson." His voice, normally booming with authority, was subdued. "Mind if I have a word?" James pushed himself upright, ignoring the dull ache in his chest. "Sir?" He gestured to the chair by his bed. Max, awake now, eyed the newcomer but remained calm. As the days passed, the slow rhythm of hospital life settled into a kind of uneasy calm. Officer James Anderson had begun to accept that he wouldn't be returning to his old high-octane patrol duties anytime soon, if ever. The heart attack he'd survived, alongside Officer Bennett's own collapse, had spurred real policy shifts in the department. Yet, those same changes produced friction among the ranks, and James couldn't help but feel responsible for the turbulence swirling back at the precinct. Captain Ellis tried to keep everyone focused, but rumors abounded. Some officers welcomed the new mandatory wellness checks, believing it would save lives. Others saw it as an unwelcome intrusion, complaining that desk doctors and politicians were micromanaging their personal habits. Each side blamed the other for the tension. Ellis found himself fielding phone calls at all hours. Union representatives demanding clarity, the mayor's office wanting reassurance, and the hospital staff requesting input on a pilot therapy dog program featuring Max. The captain often rubbed tired eyes and told his assistants, "I appreciate the new measures, Plankton, but we're drowning in red tape." Meanwhile, James, despite his physically limited state, felt a stirring restlessness. Dr. Huang had cleared him for short walks within the hospital, accompanied by Max or a nurse. During these strolls, he saw the strain etched into the faces of staff and visitors. News stories about the precinct's health crisis circulated in the media, painting a dramatic picture of overworked officers. He couldn't ignore how onlookers gave him sympathetic or even pitying glances, as if he was a wounded soldier on parade. One afternoon, James stepped into the hospital courtyard for a breath of fresh air. Max trotted beside him, tail wagging at the smells of grass and distant food carts. They found an unoccupied bench. James sank onto it with a weary sigh. "We're in the spotlight, buddy," he murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. "I don't know if I'm ready for all these changes." Across the courtyard, he noticed a group of off-duty officers, some from his precinct, some from others, speaking in hushed tones. Their conversation halted the moment they spotted James and Max. One of them, a tall veteran named Franco, offered a curt nod, but turned away quickly. James felt an odd pang. Was it sympathy, respect, or resentment that made them withdraw? Officer Bennett, as still recuperating, often shared a hospital lunch table with James when their schedules aligned. On one such day, Bennett arrived in a wheelchair. His own discharge date was imminent, though he was set to leave the force entirely. The gloom in his eyes was unmistakable. "I put in my retirement paperwork," he told James quietly. "Chief signed off. I can't risk another attack, and my family's too important." James nodded. "I understand. You've got to do what's best for you." Yet, a conflict of emotions tugged at his heart. Relief that Bennett was prioritizing his life, mingled with sadness at losing another good cop on the streets. Bennett mustered a small grin. "At least you'll still be around in some form. Word is Captain Ellis wants you as a training officer, something with Max and community outreach, right?" "Something like that," James said. He looked at Max, who lay at his feet, ears swiveling toward every new voice. "Still figuring it out." Local reporters pressed for an exclusive interview with James and Max, hoping to highlight the miracle dog story. James wasn't keen on turning his personal crisis into a spectacle, but he also recognized that shining a spotlight on the issues of stress and burnout in law enforcement might spark further reforms. Dr. Costa, occasionally checking on him, suggested he at least consider it. "People respond to real stories," she said. "If the public sees how Max saved your life and hears about the circumstances that led to your heart attack, it could push for better support systems across emergency services." Max, as if in agreement, tapped a paw lightly on James's foot, making him chuckle despite his reservations. Back at the precinct, tensions crested. Some officers threatened to file grievances over the new health mandates, seeing them as an invasion of privacy. Others applauded the reforms, hoping to avoid the tragic scenarios faced by James and Bennett. Captain Ellis, feeling the heat from above and below, requested James's presence at a departmental meeting via video call. "We need your voice," Ellis said, his tone earnest over the phone. "People respect you, and they love Max. If you speak up, it might cool tempers." Reluctantly, James agreed. On the scheduled evening, hospital staff set up a secure connection from a small conference room. Max lay beside James's chair, head resting on his paws, as they dialed in. The screen filled with a patchwork of uniformed faces, some guarded, some curious. Ellis began by recapping the reason for the meeting, addressing misconceptions about the wellness initiatives. Then he turned the floor over to James, who took a steadying breath, heart fluttering with nerves. "Most of you know I nearly died in that alley," he said, voice subdued but clear. "Max saved me, Without him, I wouldn't be here. But ask yourselves, what led to me being so vulnerable in the first place? Some officers stiffened. Others leaned forward, attention rapt. James continued, "We push ourselves. Double shifts, skipping meals, ignoring pains, because we think we have to be invincible. But none of us are. We owe it to ourselves and each other to stop equating constant exhaustion with dedication." A brief hush followed. Then questions poured in. Aren't we short-staffed? What about criminals who don't take breaks? What if the public sees us as weak? James fielded them as best he could, emphasizing that a healthy, supported force was more effective in the long run. Captain Ellis chimed in, reinforcing that they were exploring new ways to ensure manpower without sacrificing officers' health. By the end of the call, the mood was noticeably lighter. Some skeptics softened their stance. A few who remained unconvinced refrained from open hostility. Ellis concluded the conference with a nod to James and Max. If these two can show us that we can't keep ignoring our limits, then maybe it's time we listened. As the video feed disconnected, James felt an odd mix of relief and anticipation. He'd stepped into a role he never saw coming, an advocate for change within a system he once thought unshakable. Maxie, stretching and yawning at his side, offered a reassuring nudge. It was as if the dog sensed that the real work was just beginning, paving a path for officers to serve without sacrificing their own well-being. Rossman sank into the chair, exhaling. For a moment, he studied James's face, then Max's. "I've seen the footage from that day, the dashcam. God, James, you were seconds from—" He trailed off, clearing his throat again. "Max is a damn hero, and so are you, for all you've done over the years." James swallowed, unsure how to respond. Rossman's gaze flicked to Max. "The department wants to honor him, some kind of medal, a ceremony, but that's not why I'm here." He paused. "We need you on the inside, James, as a training officer or a liaison for K9 programs. I know you're not fit for the streets yet, and maybe not ever in the old sense, but I'd hate to lose your experience and your bond with this dog." A wave of relief, laced with apprehension, coursed through James. He's offering me a new path, he realized. Yet the fear remained. Would such a role satisfy the part of him that loved active policing? And could he handle the lingering guilt if someone else took Max into the field? For a moment, the only sound was Max's steady breathing. Rossman's eyes dropped to the floor. "Look, the department's under pressure. Morale's shaky. If you're willing, you could help shape how we treat officer wellness. Show them that you can still serve, even after something like this." James felt tears threaten, quickly blinking them away. I appreciate that, Chief. Truly. I'm scared." The admission tasted bitter, but also liberating. Scared of letting the team down, or losing Max, or failing to protect anyone if I'm stuck behind a desk. Rossman's voice gentled. "Protecting your colleagues from going through what you did isn't letting the team down. It's saving them in a different way." Max let out a soft whine, as if echoing the chief's sentiment. James shifted to pet the dog's ears, the familiar motion calming him. Dire quiet resolve filled the room. He glanced back at Rossman. "Then let's talk details," he murmured. Unknown to them, Dr. Huang had been passing by, overhearing fragments of the conversation. A faint smile curved her lips. This was precisely the outcome she'd hoped for. James wasn't just healing physically. He was finding a renewed sense of purpose, one that didn't risk his life every shift. She slipped away, giving them privacy to work out the specifics. After Rossman departed, James felt more exhausted than any day of therapy had left him. Yet a cautious optimism sparked in his chest. A new job in training, or K9 liaison, meant he could keep Max. We'd still be a team, just serving differently. Relief warred with the pang of nostalgia for adrenaline-fueled patrols. But Max's unwavering gaze reminded him that there was more than one way to be a hero. Survival and continued service were not mutually exclusive. Before he drifted to sleep, James gently cupped Max's muzzle. "Hang in there with me, partner," he whispered. "We're not done yet." The dog thumped his tail softly, a promise of loyalty that transcended gunfights and manhunts, extending into this uncertain realm of second chances. A subdued hush fell over James Anderson's hospital room, as he neared his discharge date. The faint beeping of monitors provided a calming rhythm, one that Max, lying on a small dog bed in the corner, seemed to match with each slow rise and fall of his chest. Despite the measured pace, a quiet sense of anticipation crackled in the air. Everyone at the precinct, in the hospital, and even in the community waited to see what would happen next. Would James return to the force, retire like Bennett, or find a new way to serve? On a bright morning, just a day before James's release, Captain Ellis, Detective Delgado, Dr. Huang, and a few close officers assembled in the hospital's small conference room. James Ectoy, still wearing a loose-fitting t-shirt and sweatpants instead of his usual uniform, joined them with Max at his side. The tension was palpable. In the center of the table lay a folder containing official documents, medical evaluations, departmental memos, and a proposed job description labeled Community Outreach and Canine Therapy Integration. Ellis cleared his throat, tapping the folder. "We've all been discussing this pilot program," he said quietly, meeting James's eyes. "And James, we'd like you to lead it." James glanced around, heart thumping with more than just residual cardiac strain. The notion of stepping into a specialized role, one focusing on officer wellness, canine therapy visits, and bridging the gap between high-pressure policing and community care, felt both exhilarating and daunting. "I appreciate this," he managed, voice tight. "But I've got concerns." He turned to Dr. Huang. "Medically, I'm cleared to leave the hospital, but I'm not at peak physical condition. Will I ever be the same officer I was before?" Dr. Huang offered a gentle smile. "Maybe not the same," she said, "but you can still be an outstanding officer in a different capacity. Your heart needs less stress, consistent follow-ups, and a balanced schedule. That doesn't mean you're unfit to contribute. It just means adjusting how." Ellis nodded. "And from a policing standpoint, we need your experience. The truth is, many officers suffer in silence. If you, with Max by your side, show them there's value in self-care, it might shift our culture." A hush settled as James let those words sink in. He thought back to Bennett's decision to retire, the line of worried younger officers outside his hospital room, and the emotional meltdown that nearly cost him his own life. If he returned to standard patrol, he might replicate the same stress patterns that led to his heart attack. But if he didn't go back at all, he'd lose the bond he had with Max, not to mention the sense of purpose he'd had since joining the force. Perhaps this new position could be a middle ground. Detective Delgado cleared her throat. "We also have to talk about Max. He's a certified patrol K9, trained for detection and suspect apprehension. But we've all seen how adept he is at providing emotional support. Kids in the hospital light up around him, and he practically saved your life by acting outside standard training. If we move forward, we'll need to reclassify him for part-time therapy visits while maintaining some of his patrol skills." James's gaze fell to Max, who lay attentive, ears perked. "I couldn't bear to see him reassigned," he admitted, voice almost trembling. He's more than a partner. He's my friend. He's family." A small wave of compassion swept through the room. Dr. Huang rested a hand on James's arm. "Then it's settled. We adapt to your new reality. We let Max help in a new way. Still a K9, but with therapy-based tasks added. And you'd be in a supportive position where your risk is minimized." Captain Ellis scratched his jaw, acknowledging the lingering tension in the department. "We'll get pushback from some old-school types who believe a K9 is strictly for patrol, and that an officer with a heart condition belongs behind a desk, if at all. But maybe we can show them that policing can be broader, that an officer who's survived a heart attack can still serve effectively." James exhaled, relief mingling with apprehension. This was the final piece he needed: official support from above, unwavering belief in his new path. "I accept," he said softly, a tremor in his voice that betrayed both nerves and excitement. "Let's do this." Moments later, word spread that James was signing paperwork to confirm his transition. As if on cue, Officer Bennett, outfitted in civilian clothes and using a cane for balance, arrived at the conference room doorway. "Heard you're forging a new path," Bennett said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm proud of you, man." James approached, clasping Bennett's hand. "I wish you'd stay, but I get it. You've got to do what's best for you." Bennett nodded. "Same goes for you. We both face the worst." "At least I can leave knowing the department's in good hands." Max trotted up to Bennett, sniffing around his cane, and gave a light wag of the tail as if to welcome him back. The older officer crouched, grimacing slightly at the strain, and ruffled the dog's ears. "Thanks for saving my friend," Bennett murmured, a tear slipping down his cheek. The day before James's discharge, a small impromptu gathering took place in the hospital courtyard. A handful of officers, hospital staff, and even local reporters showed up, wanting to witness a moment of recognition for Max. In a brief, heartfelt ceremony, Captain Ellis pinned a small commendation medal to Max's canine harness. The German Shepherd tilted his head, tail wagging in confusion at the applause. James, leaning on a cane for support, looked on with misty eyes. "He's more than earned this." A hush fell as Ellis spoke, voice resonating in the courtyard. "Max stands as a reminder that sometimes devotion and empathy are the greatest weapons an officer can wield. Without him, we'd have lost one of our finest. James, you owe him your life, and we owe you both a new beginning." That evening, James finally left the hospital, walking out the front doors at a measured pace, Max at his side. Detective Delgado was there to drive them home, but not before a small group of staff and officers clapped quietly. He paused to smile, a mixture of relief, humility, and cautious hope flickering across his face. His heart still fluttered occasionally with the echoes of trauma, but he felt stronger, strong enough to forge a new path that balanced duty and well-being. In the back seat, Max curled up contentedly, no longer whining with worry. The dog seemed to sense that James would be all right. He'd found a second chance, one they could seize together. As the car pulled away from Riverside County General, James closed his eyes, recalling the frantic moment he collapsed in that alley. One desperate bark from Max changed everything. Now, that bark echoed not just in his memory but across an entire police force, forced to acknowledge its own fragility and capacity for transformation. Officer James Anderson left Riverside County General Hospital under the waning light of late afternoon. Standing at the entrance, he paused a moment, hand drifting to his chest, where he still felt faint twinges of the ordeal he'd survived. At his side, Max sat attentively, his tail thumping softly against James's leg. This was not the triumphant exit James might have envisioned months before. It was a quieter victory, one woven from gratitude, humility, and a promise of change. Behind him lay hospital corridors that had borne witness to two near tragedies, his own heart attack and Officer Bennett's collapse. Yet in that same place, hope had taken root. Doctors, fellow officers, and even city officials had rallied around the call for better health measures and a more compassionate culture. No longer would silent suffering be worn as a badge of honor. James Codes, along with his canine partner, symbolized a new approach, one that recognized the humanity behind every badge and the necessity of balance for those who serve. That evening, riding home with Detective Delgado, James let his gaze wander out the window. He thought of the future waiting at the precinct, a new position that combined training younger recruits, fostering canine therapy initiatives, and forging ties between law enforcement and community wellness programs. It wasn't the adrenaline-fueled street patrol he once knew, but it offered a chance to protect and serve in a deeper, more sustainable way. And Max, always at his side, would continue to be the steadfast partner he had proven to be in that alley. As the cruiser turned onto James's street, a gentle warmth spread through his chest. No longer a crippling pain, but a reassuring reminder that he was alive, thanks to a dog's unwavering devotion. The journey ahead might be fraught with challenges, from bureaucratic hurdles to personal doubts, yet he felt ready to face them. Max's steady gaze in the rearview mirror confirmed it. They'd tackle whatever came next, side by side. If James and Max's story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think law enforcement agencies should balance high-pressure duty with officer well-being? And have you witnessed a canine companion changing someone's fate? Let us know. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more inspiring stories where courage and compassion redefine what it means to be a hero.